I live in what I like to think of as a safe neighborhood. Recently, however, at a house just up the street, I noticed disturbing evidence of possible criminal activity, or at the very least a violation of local zoning laws. What stopped me short one morning as I was walking my dog was the sight of a human corpse smashed up against the front of this house. I'm not quite sure to what category the poor dead creature belongs. It was flat as a pancake and had evidently hit the house at a high rate of speed. To me, it appeared to be a witch. Among the seasonal decorations at the house, a plastic pumpkin, a sheaf of Indian corn, a silhouette of a black cat arching its back. This grisly, flattened body with a witch's hat still in place and a broom also stuck to the siding sent a shudder of revulsion mixed with pity down my spine. One could picture the accident all too clearly. A young witch, hardly more than a child, is flying too fast on her broom. Then, crash! The little arms outstretched on either side, the green fingers spread in a hopeless last-minute attempt to soften the impact, were enough to break your heart. The negligence of the homeowner was all the more shocking because he or she happened to have a cemetery in the front yard. Small, gray plastic tombstones announced that Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman were all interred there. Surely it would not be too much to hope that the unlucky little witch be given a decent burial as well, even if she was not a celebrity. One of the mourners who was visiting the cemetery, a lanky young fellow who wore a hockey mask and carried a chainsaw, stood unmoving, as if in shock, beside the Wolfman's grave. "Did you know him?" I asked quietly. The grief-stricken fellow did not reply. A troubling detail about the grave of Dracula caught my eye. It was a skeletal arm reaching out of the well-manicured lawn. If Dracula had in fact been buried alive, as the skeleton arm seemed to suggest, that made a certain amount of unfortunate sense. When you spend your days lying in a coffin, you run the risk of this kind of mix-up. But how did no one see the arm waving in the air after it had laboriously burst through the sod? And why was it ignored, waving and waving, ever more slowly, until death finally arrived, blessedly for the supposedly deathless vampire? Rigor mortis then set in, followed by weeks and months of rot and decay and scavenging by local animals until the bones of the arm were all that remained. What kind of clueless homeowners could fail to notice such a hideous process taking place on their own front lawn? Enough was enough. I walked to the front door and rang the bell. A handsome, smiling couple in late middle age answered. We got to talking, and that, in short, is how I happened to run for and be elected to the Chatsworth School Board. If the story had ended there, all would have been well. But, sadly, a sequel occurred to darken that happy outcome. It started out quite innocently. As the school board president, I proposed a new policy mandating that only healthy snacks be given to trick-or-treaters. The ordinance was duly voted upon and passed, and I offered to keep an eye open for any violators. Going around the neighborhood and looking in windows, I noticed that the Hamst family seemed to have some snack-sized boxes of Milk Duds ready in a wooden salad bowl by the door. I went around to the back and met Mr. and Mrs. Hamst coming in from the garage. I told them, very politely, that the treats I had observed in their front hall were not allowed. Overreacting, Mr. Hamst began to shout and turn red in the face. In a matter of seconds, he had a heart attack and dropped dead. Of course, I felt terrible. I thought that the very least I could do was to offer to defray some of the funeral costs, and suggested to my helpful neighbors with the front yard cemetery that we give Mr. Hamst a plot there. They proceeded to inform me that it was not a real cemetery. Now, I had wondered why the mourner with the chainsaw remained in the exact same position for hours and even weeks without leaving for food and other necessities, but I had not wanted to pry, and my neighbors did not go out of their way to correct any mistaken impression I might have had. I'm sure there's a lesson somewhere in all this. Building a community takes patience, time, and sometimes a regrettable loss of life. But we also have a double standard. The fact remains that a long-dead, decaying young witch is still plastered against my neighbor's house. Let's try a little thought experiment. Would the corpse of a full-grown warlock, a male individual with some power and influence, be subjected to such indignity if he happened to be flying on a much larger broom and ended up smashing into the wall of someone's house? I think we can all agree that the answer is obvious.